it's really fun for me to talk about some of my passions that have to do with my Nordic heritage and also just the work that I do. So when I first became fascinated with runelore, it was probably my preteen days when I read J.R.R. Tolkien's work for the first time. And if those of you that have read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings know what I'm talking about in terms of runelore and the languages that he made up that were based on Scandinavian history. And I just became obsessed with that. Then when I went to college, I had two ambitions. One was to be an archaeologist, because I wanted to dig in the dirt. And the second was to be a painter. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they were a little far apart. But having been raised by Norwegian grandparents, I was very practical also. And I thought, you know what, I better have a backup plan. And so my degrees varied between archaeology and business. And I ended up taking on a career in business for 30 years because I didn't really have the notion I wanted to be a starving artist. And digging in the dirt wasn't as appealing once I actually went on some field digs. It's a lot of work, but not a lot of reward necessarily. So after 30 years of doing that, though, I finally thought, you know what, I could venture out and try that starving artist routine. And I found that instead of being really any good at painting, I was much better at working with my hands. And so I embarked on a career of metalsmithing. And what is really fun for me about that journey is that I now get to incorporate my love of Norwegian history and mythology into the work that I create, and I get to put a modern spin on it. So I'll show you some examples of the work that I do. One of the things that I always like to tell people about learning about runes, this is a set of runes that are made into metal stamps, and they're based on the Elder Futhark runes that we're going to talk about today. But I always like to say that there are many, many scholars who have devoted their life's work to studying runelore and the alphabets as well as the mythologies behind the runes. I do not consider myself an expert on all of those things, but I am obsessed with it, and I like to look at the mythology primarily and really enjoy what they have to offer in the modern world. So I'm going to give you a very, very short history of the runes themselves. Runes, the word itself means secrets and mystery, so the actual translation of it. And when you look at runes, they were really used for two things. One, they were an actual alphabet, but primarily used as symbols that describe concepts. And when you look at the runes to describe a concept, they were often looking for insights into what their fate would be. And so they were used for divination purposes, and also for the very mundane things in terms of writing messages. So a lot of the rune stones that have been uncovered are very just simply identifying who wrote the runes. And some actually say, go here. Some are considered graffiti. So there's a lot of different uses that the runes have had over the centuries. The runes, in the terms of the dating of it, this is the order in which that we know the runes existed. So the oldest known runes are the Elder Futhark, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Following that, the derivations from that, the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, which is just a slight variation in it refers to the phonetic translation of the first part of the runes. And then the younger Futhark. And then further on, the divisions went into medieval runes. And there's quite a few discoveries that have been made that use the medieval runes. There's some exciting work that's being uncovered right now in Denmark and Norway. And then up through the 20th century, doll runes were used in Sweden. And so they really have had a long and checkered history and in terms of being in use. So I don't consider them a dead language, that's for certain. One of the earliest discoveries, I think the earliest Elder Futhark runes that is on wood here is the Vimos comb. This was found in Denmark, and it has they've dated it So it is in the Elder Futhark era. The comb itself, the runes on the top read Harja, and there's a really interesting, fun translation. It either means the person's name, or it means warrior, or it means comb. So there's a lot of thought that's been given to what this possibly could mean. And I just thought that was really fun. So clearly we don't know everything. But what is really interesting about this piece and what makes it so fascinating is that these runes were carved on wood, and wood doesn't generally wear all that well. And the fact that this was still intact is pretty remarkable. Most runes that we see today that have survived history are on stone. There's a lot of rune stones that have been found throughout Scandinavia, and also on metal work. And so I'll show you a couple of examples of those as well. So the other one that was an early find was in Norway. This was in Oppland, Norway. And this was a gravestone. It now has its own little museum, as you can see. And the letters are actually inscribed in the stone, but you notice that they're red. They use paint to paint them red. And this particular stone, the text simply reads, I, the maker, painted the runes, instead of being an epitaph like we consider on gravestones today. So it's very mundane. So just wanted to identify that I was the one who made this. A really exciting discovery was made just in fall of 2021 in Denmark. This is near Jelling, which is an important age, Viking age seat of culture and power. And if you're familiar at all with the Jelling runestone, that's one of the most famous runestones that was discovered. This particular hoard contains hundreds of pieces of gold. And this particular find, they're just doing some translation with some of the runes on here. You can see in the center circle, there's runes along the top. And then the figure is Odin, and his horse is in there. So it's really got some wonderful ancient mythology built into the piece. These were known as brachiats, which is a neck piece. They're rather large, and there were several of them in this particular find. It just went on display in a museum in Denmark in February. So if you have a chance to travel to Denmark, this is now available for the public to see. So it should be pretty exciting to be able to go and look at this. And then the most recent find that I think is really exciting is in Norway. This is in Medieval Park in Oslo. The woman in the picture is an archaeologist, and she's holding up a piece of wood that has runes inscribed on them. They're currently being dated. They think they're around the medieval period, but this is so new that they haven't translated yet. There was also a large piece of bone that was discovered in this particular find. And so it just shows you that there's still a lot we need to know, a lot of discoveries to be made, and hopefully we'll be able to visit there as well once they get these on display. So origins and uses of the runes over the centuries. We know that they were native to Northern European cultures. They have roots in Roman times as well. The alphabets have a lot of similarity to Roman alphabet, but their culture and their roots are really in that pagan world, the Old Norse world, where there were the high gods and goddesses, roots in the elemental forces of nature, and also with the world of giants and dwarves. So all of that mythology comes into play. And similarly to a tarot deck and the I Ching, where they used hexagrams, runes were thought to be keys to personal enlightenment. So if you were to cast rune stones, similarly to casting I Ching hexagrams, you would read what your fate would be. And so they're more than just fortune-telling tokens, but they really had some similarities to the way they were used with mythological purposes. So each rune also has a correspondence in the ancient Norse mythology, and this particular quote from the poem of the Elder Edda, "Whosoever holds them unbroken, unchanged, will have good luck and be glad of his lore until the day of doom." And so this is referring specifically to people who discover the runes and roots in Odin. So we'll delve a little bit deeper into the rune roots. This is from Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. And the story goes that Odin went down to the world tree and he wanted to bring up wisdom. And in order to do that, he had to make sacrifices. The first sacrifice was to give up an eye. And in order to get the wisdom, he gave up his eye, and then he was able to dip into the well of Erd and bring up the runes to share with the world. The second sacrifice he had to make was to make a spear out of a branch of the tree and stab himself. And then the third sacrifice was to hang upside down for 9 days. And, great guy, right? But given all that, he was able to bring up the runes and share them with the people of Midgard, which were one of the 9 worlds, and that's the human race. So there were 3 roots of this tree that penetrate the worlds. The first dips into that well of Erd, which is, we'll talk a little bit about more, which is in Asgard. So the Asgard was the home of the high gods of Aesir. The Norns weave the fates of gods and men, and they are the ones who tend the tree and the well. The second root goes into Mimir's spring, from which the waters of inspiration gush forth. And that was the second important root. And the third root goes to Hel, which was one of the 9 worlds where a dragon dwells. So that gives you just a little bit of the story of Odin and descending into the tree roots. So the word weird, however you pronounce it, is also the same word as Erd, and it means fate. And it also refers to the mysteries of the universe. So when we talk about going to the well of Erd, we're talking about going in and delving into the mysteries of what was the past, what's the present, and what the future will hold. So it is a web, also is referred to as the web of Erd, which holds all of the universe and that will continue to shape life and our experiences. So the Norns, who guard the well, the first Norn, her name was also Erd. Her name is Fate, and she was the eldest of the Norns. And there's a lot of cultures that use this concept of the 3 sisters who watch over. In Greek mythology, the 3 fates, Maiden, Mother, and Crone. There are also the weaving sisters who spin and measure out and cut the threads of your life. And they were called upon to pronounce the fate over newborns. And there's many stories in the Poetic Edda that talk about going to a family that's just had a son who was going to be a prince and wanting to know what his fate would be. And so they would call upon the wisdom of the Norns. So the quote here is, "Much wisdom have the 3 maidens who come from the waters close to that tree. They established laws, decided the lives men were to lead, and marked out their fate." So that's a little bit of the kind of mythological history of it. And when I look at runes, and I think about all those wonderful stories that were told about how they could be called upon, I've always been fascinated with how they were used in everyday life and how they could be used today. I look at them as more than just utilitarian alphabets. And that is definitely a school of thought, that there are many, many scholars who devote their time to studying the alphabets and making direct translations. I am more interested in that mythological, the symbols of them and how they were used for divination, how they were used for blessings, and also for wayfinding. There are many, many parallels, I think, in terms of what it must have been like in the Viking Age and how difficult life would be and how you worked for survival, and parallels to what people are going through in any era. And certainly we don't live in any times that we could consider happy right at the moment. So there's a lot of chaos, and people call upon these types of symbols for hope and for inspiration. And carving the runes really gave you something tangible that you could call upon. So instead of just speaking the words aloud, they would carve them into pieces of wood, as you see here. You were encouraged to make your own set of runes and carry them with you. People still do that today. They're also obviously more long-lasting if they're carved into something durable like stone or metal. But it gives it a solidity, sort of gives it more significance. And when I looked at that, when I wanted to make jewelry, I thought about how I could use them in metalwork because it would have long-lasting qualities. They wouldn't just wash away, and it would give you something to remember. And so applying these symbols into jewelry and household objects kind of gives you that sense of being a talisman that you could carry with you and call upon for comfort and hopefully for guidance as you went along your way. So when we look at the actual runes themselves, we're going to look at the Elder Futhark, and this is why they're called Futhark. It refers to the first 6 runes in the 24-character alphabet, and these are the first 6 in order, and it's a phonetic translation. So the first rune is Fehu, and there's a literal meaning, and there's also mythological meaning. So we'll talk a little bit about these. I'm not going to go through all 24 runes with you because that would take hours, so I'll hold it to 6. So Fehu, which translates into cattle, also translates into abundance and wealth. And if you can imagine, holding cattle was a sign of bounty, that if you had that kind of means, it would provide food and clothing and shelter, the way you could use cattle, and also for trade. So it was a very important symbol of abundance. The next rune, Urus, which is also Urox. There are many different kind of twists on the word, but this is the one that I know, means wild ox. And the symbol itself looks like the horns of an ox, if you look at it upside down. And it refers to challenge, refers to energy and strength and meeting challenges head on, like just going for it, like a wild ox you might see it running through. Also governed the rites of passage, so facing difficult times. The third rune is Thurasaz, which is the rune itself, the pronunciation is with the TH sound, and it looks like a thorn, and it means thorn. It also means giant. So there's a couple of different translations with this particular rune. People associate this rune with Thor, the giant slayer, and facing thorny problems, facing hostile forces. I consider it a protection rune. And so it actually looks like a thorn if you look at it sideways. The next rune is Ansuz, which also has 2 interesting translations. The first one is Odin or God, and the second translation is breath. And you think, well, what do they have to do with each other? It's interesting because it's really talking about the wisdom of the gods and breath being communication. So sharing ideas and learning from each other and listen before you speak. And so it was about taking a breath before you delve into trying to solve a problem. And you can imagine that would be very important as you're negotiating with perhaps warring factors. The next rune is Rado, which is for riding. This is a rune that was used for governing travel or helping you in a journey. And it's more than just simply going on a journey. It's about forward movement. So it's about taking risks. It's about striking out, not living in fear and not being stagnant in your life, but about being able to take that forward momentum, even against all odds. And then the last rune in this series is Kinaz, which translates a couple things. The one that we know best is torch or fire. And it's about illumination, about being a light in the darkness, and about passion. And this is about wisdom of the heart. So it's really about love and friendship, and also creativity and ongoing learning. The other meaning for this one is boil, and that was a sore. So you can imagine 2 very different translations of this particular rune, and they're both equally valid. I happen to like the fire one better. I think the boil sounds kind of painful. So when they put the runes together in the Elder Futhark, they relied upon this discovery. It was very important from Sweden, the Gravestone, which is in sequence from left to right, the runes in order, all 24. So that's how they have decided that the runes went in that sequence. I would love to see this stone in person. It's really kind of fun. This is sort of like your origin stone. So when you look at connecting runes to mythology and how you might be interested in using them, I am not as interested in some of the well-known mythology that everybody knows about, Odin and Thor and Loki. Those are really well-known stories, but I have a particular passion for discovering things that are a little less well-known, and that is about the Old Norse goddesses. So I've made it my work in the last couple of years to discover what mythologies were written about them. And what's interesting to me is not only were there a lot of goddesses who had very important roles in the world of mythology, but that there was an equal partnership between male and female. That Odin, yes, brought the runes, but he was given them, access to them by the Norns, who were female. And I just think that's wonderful. So if you dig deeper, you really look at kind of the richer history of the runes and where they came from in the Well of Erd. One of my very favorite goddesses is Saga, which is a wonderful name because it means story. And of course, we know all about sagas certainly from the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. But her story, which I think is lovely, is that she lived in a home called Sokvabek, which translates to the sinking brook. And she would sit nightly at her spring in her water, and she would share a cup out of the spring with Odin, who would come join her in the evening. And they would swap stories about what happened during the day. And they would weave those stories, they would tell them by dipping them into the water and putting them back in the water, they got woven into humans' dreams. And so they were there to help you gain collective knowledge about what was happening tomorrow. And I just think that's a lovely story. And I think as far as the word saga and some of her history, if you look at Norway's national anthem, if you read the words, there are words that actually come from saga. And I would sing it, but I don't know how. One of the most famous of the goddesses was Frigg, who was the queen of the Aesir and also the wife of Odin. And she had a lot of jobs. So if you look at what she had to do, she was the goddess of the home and the family, motherhood, domestic affairs. She was my favorite goddess because it was about smithing. She oversaw crafts and smithing. She also oversaw the social order and relationships in the community. And there again, if you can imagine, why did she have so much going on? In those times when people were in the Viking Age, the men were off doing Viking. They were conquering, they were traveling, they were gone a lot. The women were at home keeping everything together. And what was interesting about her role was that she was called upon to solve squabbles, to make sure that people got along, to make sure that the crops got sown and harvested. And so she had a lot to do in terms of keeping things in order. She's associated with the runes Berkana, which is the rune for birch. It also means new beginnings. And so she was toasted at weddings and also called upon for safe births. So thinking about petitioning people, they would come and give her gifts to make sure that things were going okay and smoothly in their life. So the other runes that she's associated with, in addition to Gabo, which is gifts, was Urus, the rites of passage, Raido for travel, Kinas for creativity, and Wunjo for joy and harmony. So she had a lot of runes that were associated and used in the artifacts that have been found throughout Scandinavia that have many, many household objects and also women's jewelry. So, of course, she's near and dear to my heart because of the jewelry connection. Got to have that. And then some of the other notable goddesses and their rune connections. Skadi, who was married to Uller, he was the god of winter, and she was the goddess of winter. And the rune is Isa, which is ice. And Gefjon was associated with Gebo, which translates really not just gift giving, it's about generosity. And it's about if you were a person traveling and you needed shelter from someplace and you saw a farm, they would invite you in. And it was a matter of survival. But that was a reciprocity that people would give to each other in terms of hospitality. So that rune was really important to people. Freya, everybody knows about Freya. She's considered the goddess of love and fertility, but also a warrior goddess. And similarly to Frigg, she has a lot of runes associated with her character and what she was known for. And some of the scholars will say that they were one and the same person. And I like to think of them as different people, different individuals, but that's just me. And then the last one I wanted to share was Nertus, and she's associated with Fehu, being the goddess of Earth's abundance. So if you wanted your crops to succeed, if you wanted to have lots of newborn cattle, sheep, whatever, you'd call upon her to ensure your survival. So very important in terms of the kinds of offerings that you would make. So now you know my favorite goddesses. So talking more about the runes, each rune has symbols and meanings associated with them. So I'm going to just talk about one of them because, again, we could go on for hours, and I'm sure you'd probably like to go home instead, but I could do this all day. Each symbol, or rune staff, carries many meanings. There's a literal meaning, which we talked a little bit about, and Fehu is the example, which means cattle. But it also has an omen associated to it, which is wealth and abundance. And then the legendary mythical connections, these are based on stories and oral traditions and wisdom passed down through the generations. But there were several sets of rune poems that were written, and there were 3 important poems. There's the Old English, there's the Norwegian rune poems, and the Icelandic rune poems. And I'm going to share with you examples for Fehu. And then the last thing to know about each of the runes, this is a really good example of if you were to cast a rune and you saw the symbol of Fehu that was right side up, it would talk about abundance. But if it was upside down, it was a warning. It was about look out for greed. So the opposite of abundance is too much. And so they're looking out for excess. So when we look at the rune poems associated with Fehu, you'll see some warnings in there. The first Old English poem, which it dates 450 to 1110 CE. Wealth provides comfort, but you must share it, who hope to cast lots for judgment before the gods. So this was telling people, I think, yes, abundance is great, but be sure you're not just greedy about it. Norwegian, on the other hand, talks about money causes strife among kin. The wolf grows up in the woods. And those are fascinating. I have no idea what that means. But you can imagine that this was a warning of some sort. And then the Icelandic, which is really similar, money caused strife among kin, and the fire of the flood tide and the path of the serpent. They're, again, kind of ominous, aren't they? But every rune has an association with the poems that you see. So I point this out simply for you to go explore on your own if you're interested in learning more about some of the mythological history, because I think it's really interesting and it gives you a richer sense of what the runes are all about. So when you use runes, if you want them to be meaningful to you, one of the things to look for is relating it to what's going on currently. So if you're calling upon a rune in today's times, you need to know what it is that you're asking for. So it's having a question in mind and also thinking about what the context is in terms of, whatever passage in life that you're going through. And it's not really intended to be just rote dogma or something that you would look at once and never look at again. So they have a nice fluidity, I think, in terms of how they can be used for you. So I think the fascination with runes has waxed and waned. And I think we have been in some times just in the last, I'd say 5 years, where the interest has waxed again, and people looking deeper into what that history was and how we can make connections with current times. And there's been a lot of different adaptations of the messages, and people have used them throughout different religions and cults, and also in everyday living. And just a few 20th century examples. Runes were used in German mysticism before Nazi Germany, but then it got transmorphed into what the Nazis used. And so obviously they took it for their own meaning. And that's I think to me, kind of a life lesson about how you use something like this. Scientific studies and translations by a lot of different authors have led to many interpretations. And I think I've read probably 12 books on rune lore, and they all have their own different bent. Some really look at just specifically the alphabet, some look just at the mythology and the connection to the rune poems, but others also take it and give it their own interpretation. What you want to see of it is what you make of it. And so I think it's just interesting, so you'll get lots of different interpretations with it. We know runes have been used a lot in modern fiction. There's a lot of movies and books that have been written in 20th and 21st centuries, certainly, and notably Tolkien, who I mentioned. And people use them in video and fantasy games. If anybody's a gamer, you probably know some of these. And then, of course, the famous Bluetooth logo, which is a combination of the H and the B of the King of Denmark, and how they created that symbol for the Bluetooth symbol. So if we look at one example, this is from the movie The Hobbit, and this is a great picture of how Tolkien took the runes and used them. They were derived from the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, but the first 24 are from the Elder Futhark. And he made a connection between the runes and Odin, to the character Gandalf in the series, who's the wizard, and also the fact that Gandalf could read the runes, and so could Elrond, the Lord of the Elves. But it could only be written or read at night on the day where the moon was on the right day in the right season, and then they would light up. Otherwise, they were invisible. So it kind of gave you a little bit of that magic. And then one other little tidbit, and you probably already can tell by now that I'm a geek when it comes to Tolkien. In Tolkien's writings, in the story of the Lord of the Rings, when the hobbits and the company go to visit Galadriel in Lothlorien, so Queen of the Elves, she gives them gifts. And so we associate the letter G with Gabo, which is gifts. And she gave Samwise, the hobbit, a gift of box with items in it, and on the lid was inscribed the G. And of course, I would say that was meant for Gabo, but Tolkien said it was for her name Galadriel. So, to each his own. And then, I don't know if anybody is a gamer, but I came across this one. I love the name, Well of Erd, Assassin's Creed, Valhalla. Now I'm not a gamer, but I would like to be, because this looks like fun. And so apparently the way this goes is your quest is to go and bring back runes from the Well of Erd. So it just looks great to me. And then this is the runes for Harald, Bluetooth. And so the H and the B, if you stack them on top of each other, they become what's known as a bind rune. And many people like to create their own bind runes by taking rune symbols and stacking them. And then it becomes something very personal. So, using runes today, when I thought about making jewelry and how I could use the runes, these are the first pieces of jewelry that I made years ago with using the runes. And I made them in silver, and I had a limited edition of individual symbols that I liked, that I thought I could use. And these were really meant to be sort of amulets. So you can also use runes in combination. So I'm going to show you an example of what I call a rune script, which is a combination of runes carefully selected for similar or corresponding meanings and also harmoniousness. And they're really, for me, it was a reminder to be open to positive change, to ask a good question when it came to looking at a rune and saying, what can I learn about this and how can I help myself in everyday life? So as kind of an aid to self-analysis, if you will, really to stimulate our imaginations. And one of the things that's important, I think, about any kind of symbology and study is not to just take that rune and just think that it's going to give you magic and hope for the best. It's really about asking yourself, what can I do in this moment to be an active participant and not just a passive observer? But they can really serve as a visual reminder. So no matter the era, I think people have been drawn to the runes and helping find our way through dark, chaotic times with different kinds of practices. Many people still do rune readings and they cast the runes. I know a lot of my students are making their own sets of runes now, and it's exciting to see that piece of it is still alive, because you can carve them into wood and also into metal. And as a way to kind of make sense out of seemingly senseless events that are happening, I think in today's times when we have some heartbreaking things going on, this can just be a little bit of hope in the darkness, if you will. And when we talk about runes, it's sort of a ritual, and we talk a lot about the power of ritual. So there's an author that has written a book recently, and he's the co-founder of the Sacred Design Lab. His name is Casper ter, and he wrote a book called The Power of Ritual. And he shared one that recently that I heard that I thought was really interesting as a way to make connections with ancient traditions as well as kind of modern soul searching, if you will. So his example was about creating a tech Sabbath. So on Friday night, when the sun goes down, he takes all of his electronic devices and hides them somewhere in his house. And then he lights a candle. And so it's similar to the Jewish tradition of Shabbat. And it's a way to take a break. It's a way to say, I don't want to be distracted by my work things or about what's going on in social media. I'm tired of doom scrolling, if you will. And so it's a way to just relax and enjoy life in a different manner. Everybody's familiar with Marie Kondo, right? The sparking joy. So she also created this as a ritual. So in seemingly mundane tasks such as decluttering or cleaning, there's a ritual involved in that where she really encourages people to ask themselves, how can I make this positive and spark joy? And then my last example of a ritual that I think is really entertaining. I was watching the Winter Olympics recently. I'm a huge fan of cross-country skiing. And Jessie Diggins, who is one of our American stars in cross-country skiing, has a wonderful ritual that she created after going through many years of self-torture, if you will. She has been very open about her history of mental health issues and about trying to be an athlete in a world and be successful. And she has successfully overcome those obstacles. So her ritual is really fun. She takes sparkle glitter and she puts it on her face, and she does it on all of her teammates. And then they wear crazy socks that are red, white, and blue stripes. And then they dance. So they're out there in the snow. If you're lucky enough to see the events, pre-race, they're out there practicing their warming up, and they're out there dancing. And I thought, that was such a wonderful message of positivity, that it's a ritual, no matter how silly it might be, but it has helped her really succeed in a very, very difficult kind of sport. So when I look at runes as adornment, this is an example of a ring that I created. This was a custom ring that I made for a gentleman who was looking for some specific help in his life, and he wanted a rune talisman that he could wear and touch. And so wearing something on your finger is a way to do that. Humans have used adornment in this way for just as long as I have seen jewelry being made, so centuries and centuries. And making them personal like this really gives it some significance as a talisman and also as something that's long-lasting. This is an example of a rune script. And when I was approached by a woman who wanted me to create a piece of jewelry for her, she was undergoing a significant change in her life, and it was distressing. And she talked a little bit with me about what she was looking for in terms of a piece of jewelry. And I take that very seriously because this is something that, it's not just, costume jewelry. And so these are the runes that we chose. So the first rune is Berkana, for a new beginning. And that's what she was looking for in her life, was a new beginning. The second rune about Rido, which is about safe journeys. She was looking to move, and so this was going to, hopefully she could call upon it to encourage her in all the chaos of moving. The third rune is Wunjo, which is for joy, and she was looking to find joy in her life again, which she hadn't had in a while. Fehu, the next rune, she was looking for abundance. She had been coming out of some really tough financial times and was looking also for some hope there. And then the last rune is Thurisaz, which is for protection. And she was looking for that as a way to face the challenges that she was facing with courage. And so these are the runes that we put together that had made sense in her life. And this was the piece that I created for her, which is, she wanted a bracelet. And I put the runes in that particular order, and in the center is a diamond, and diamond is representative of longevity, and so we wanted to commemorate that for her. And so this is an example of where she told me a couple months after she got the bracelet from me that it reminded her when she was looking at the bracelet and looking at each rune to ask herself these questions. One is, what's beginning and ending in my life? And so just kind of an acknowledgement of what was going on. How can I move forward with positivity? How can I travel forward? How does this affect my home and my relationships with other people? And where can I find joy in that? How can I capitalize on opportunities that this might bring, especially moving into a new place? And how can I maximize my new situation, avoid too much disruption, and avoid, hopefully, conflict and prevent things from going south? And so I love that she shared that with me, that these were important talismans for her. And it gave me great pride to be able to create this for her, and that she still wears it to this day. So these are just some additional examples of the pieces that I have made for people specifically. Combinations of bracelets and rings, and some just have a few runes, some have several. And so I like to pay attention to what I can bring to the wearer and how they can maximize their enjoyment of these pieces as well, and hopefully pass them down in the family. So it makes me really happy if they become heirlooms to someone. And I have some examples. Oh, that was me. I have some examples here over at the table, if you're interested, of just some of the jewelry that I had created that were not custom pieces, but can show you just some examples of what they look like on metal. And I welcome you to take a peek. And that is the end of my discussion. And I want to thank you so much for paying attention and enjoying me.